The gun pressed cold against Martha Shelton's temple was not what broke her heart that afternoon in the dying light of Caldwell, Kansas. It was the look on Louis Barnett's face, the raw, unguarded terror in his gray eyes as he stood 30 feet away, hands raised, watching a man he had trusted like a brother hold his world hostage. "You lied to me," Martha said, her voice steady even as her pulse hammered behind her ears. She was not speaking to the man with the gun. She was speaking to Louis. Louis's jaw tightened. His hands were still raised, but every muscle in his body was coiled like a spring ready to break. "Martha, I need you to stay very still and trust me." "Trust you," she repeated, and those two words carried the weight of everything she had learned in the past 20 minutes. The letters she had found in his saddlebag, the photograph she had pulled from beneath the floorboard of his cabin, the name written in ink that had changed everything she thought she knew about the man standing before her. Clyde Marsh, the man pressing steel against her skull, laughed. It was a wet, unpleasant sound like boots being pulled from deep mud. "Go on, Barnett, tell her. Tell her why you really came to Caldwell. Tell her what you were supposed to do with her ranch." The evening wind moved through the main street of Caldwell like a living thing, lifting dust and the smell of horse and burnt wood from the smithy. Somewhere behind her, Martha could hear the distant murmur of voices, townspeople who had no idea what was unfolding in the alley beside the livery stable. "It is not what you think," Louis said, and his voice cracked on the last word in a way that told Martha it was exactly what she thought. She had been in Caldwell for 14 months. She had survived drought, a prairie fire that took the south pasture, the death of her father, and the crushing weight of debt that threatened to swallow the Shelton ranch whole. She had endured all of it. But standing here now, with a gun at her head and the truth pouring like floodwater through the cracks of everything she had built with this man over the past year, she felt something inside her that she had not felt since her father died. She felt genuinely, completely alone. But she was not there yet. The story of how she and Louis Barnett arrived at this moment began 14 months earlier, in the spring of 1882, and it began, as most catastrophes do, with a letter. The letter came on the 7th of April, tucked between a seed catalog and a notice from the Caldwell First Bank regarding the outstanding balance on her father Hector Shelton's grain loan. Martha was 26 years old, standing at the kitchen table in the ranch house her father had built with his own hands, and she was 3 weeks out of mourning black. She had folded the black dress neatly and placed it in the cedar chest at the foot of her bed because she could not afford to keep grieving. The ranch demanded her full attention, and grief, she had decided, was a luxury she would revisit when the land was solvent again. The letter was from a lawyer in Wichita named Gerald Prout, and it informed her, in the careful and bloodless language of legal correspondence, that her father had borrowed a substantial sum against the deed of the Shelton Ranch, that the outstanding debt totaled $412, and that the bank expected repayment within 60 days or they would exercise their right to foreclose on the property. Martha sat down very slowly. She read the letter twice. Then she set it on the kitchen table and looked out the window at the land her father had worked for 22 years, the rolling yellow-green of the Kansas grassland stretching toward the horizon, and she thought about what it meant to lose the only thing left in the world that had ever truly belonged to her. The Shelton Ranch ran about 800 acres. They had 60 head of cattle, a small herd her father had been building up for years, a good well, a solid barn, and a reputation in Caldwell as honest people who paid their debts and worked hard. But $412 in 60 days was a mountain of money for a single woman running a ranch with only one hired hand, a 60-year-old Comanche Spanish wrangler named Pio who had worked for her father for 15 years and who Martha trusted with her life. She needed help, real help, not advice or sympathy or the casseroles the church ladies had been dropping on her porch since the funeral. She needed someone who understood cattle and land and the brutal mathematics of the frontier. She placed an advertisement in the Caldwell Commercial and also sent a copy to the Wichita Eagle. She was not advertising for a husband, though plenty of people assumed she was. She was advertising for a ranch manager, someone with experience in cattle operations, bookkeeping, and land management, willing to work for a share of profits at season's end as she could not offer a wage up front. 12 men responded. 8 of them were clearly unsuitable, too young, too vague about their experience, or in 2 cases, too obviously interested in the woman rather than the work. 3 were promising, and she wrote back asking for references and a meeting. The 12th letter was different. Louis Barnett wrote his letter by hand in clean, unhurried cursive. He had been raised in Missouri, he explained, and had spent the better part of a decade working cattle operations across Kansas and the Indian Territory. He had managed books for a ranch outside Abilene for 3 years before the owner sold. He was 30 years old, unmarried, and currently passing through Caldwell on his way to nowhere in particular. He was not a man given to false promises, he said, and he would tell her plainly that he was looking for something worth staying for. If her operation had the bones of something real, he would work harder than any 2 men she could find. Martha read that letter 3 times. There was something in it that was different from the careful, polished letters of men trying to impress her. It read like a man telling the truth because he had decided truth was the only thing worth saying. She wrote back and invited him to come the following Monday. He arrived on a gray roan mare named Cypress at 9:30 in the morning, and he was not what she expected. She had imagined someone bigger, more weathered, the kind of man whose face told the story of hard years at a glance. Louis Barnett was of medium height, lean rather than broad, with dark hair that needed cutting and a clean-shaved jaw that made him look younger than 30. He had steady gray eyes and the kind of quiet in him that Martha associated with men who had learned the hard way to think before they spoke. He shook her hand. His grip was firm but not aggressive. He looked around at the yard, the barn, the pasture, and the cattle visible in the near field, and he said, "What is the worst problem right now?" Martha liked that. She took him through the books right there at the kitchen table, spread everything out, did not hide the debt or the difficulty, and watched him work through the numbers with the focused attention of a man who understood what he was looking at. "This is manageable," he said at the end of an hour. "It is tight, but it is manageable. You need to sell 12 head at the Wichita market before the 60 days are up, which is possible if we move them soon. The rest of the operation is actually in decent shape. Your father knew what he was doing." "He did," Martha said, and she kept her voice even though his words landed somewhere tender. She hired Louis Barnett that afternoon. He moved into the small bunkhouse at the north end of the yard where Pio also slept, and he went to work immediately. He was up before dawn every morning and did not stop until dark. He learned the land with the attentiveness of someone memorizing a poem, and within a week he knew the ranch as well as Martha did. Pio watched him for the first 3 days without comment. On the 4th day, he told Martha in his characteristic understated fashion, "This one knows cattle," which from Pio was as close to enthusiastic endorsement as anyone was likely to receive. The first weeks were professional and purposeful. Martha and Louis worked alongside each other through long days and spoke plainly and practically. She noticed things about him the way you cannot help but notice things about someone when you spend most of your waking hours in their company. He was funny, occasionally, in a dry and unexpected way that caught her off guard. He read in the evenings, pulling books from a battered saddlebag with a reverence that surprised her. He was patient with the horses, and this told her something about his character that she trusted more than any reference letter. By mid-May, they had sold 14 cattle in Wichita, paid the bank debt with a margin of $40 to spare, and the ranch was back on stable ground. Martha felt the knot in her chest that had been there since her father's death loosen for the first time. That was the evening she and Louis sat on the porch after supper and watched the stars come out over the Kansas grassland, and she laughed at something he said about a particularly ornery bull named Senator, and she noticed that his smile, when it came, changed his whole face. It was not a small discovery. It settled somewhere inside her and refused to leave. She did not say anything about it. She was a practical woman. She was his employer. She had enough to manage without adding the complications of whatever this feeling was. But it grew anyway, the way things grow on the Kansas plain, quietly, persistently, without asking permission. By June, they had established a routine that felt comfortable and real. Louis handled the cattle operation and the books, which he maintained with meticulous precision. Martha managed the household, the kitchen garden, negotiations with buyers, and the broader strategic decisions about the ranch. They ate supper together most evenings at the kitchen table, and these meals stretched longer and longer as the conversations grew richer, and the silences between them became the comfortable kind rather than the careful kind. He told her about Missouri, about growing up on a small farm with his mother and two brothers after his father died, when Louis was 11. About how he had learned to love the open space of Kansas after a childhood that had felt, he said, like everything was always pressing in from all sides. About the ranch in Abilene where he had worked under a man named Cooper who had taught him that a good cattle operation was not about the cattle, it was about the land, and loving the land was the whole thing. Martha told him about her father, about the years of building this ranch from nothing, about her mother who had died when Martha was 16, and whose absence had shaped her in ways she was still discovering. She told him about the loneliness of inheriting a world that had been built for two people to run when you were now only one. He listened the way he did everything with full, unhurried attention. "You are not only one," he said quietly, on an evening in late June, and Martha looked at him across the supper table and felt the ground shift slightly beneath her. They were careful with each other after that. The feeling was clearly mutual and clearly acknowledged in ways that required no direct statement. But they were both people who moved with deliberation, and the frontier had taught them both that wanting something too much and grabbing for it fast was how you ended up with nothing. July brought a brutal stretch of heat and the first serious test of Louis's management. A fence section on the eastern boundary failed after a hard rain, and 40 cattle drifted onto a neighboring property owned by Emmett Garland, a man who was not known for patience or generosity. Martha rode out to find Louis already at the Garland fence line, speaking with Emmett with the measured calm of a diplomat, and she watched Louis absorb Emmett's bad temper without returning it, acknowledge the inconvenience with genuine apology, and negotiate the return of the cattle with such graceful practicality that Emmett Garland, a man who had once filed suit against her father over a water rights dispute, shook Louis's hand at the end of it. That evening Martha stood in the barn brushing her horse, a bay mare named Agnes, and she heard Louis come in behind her, and without planning to say anything she said, "Where did you learn to do that?" "Do what?" he asked. "Make an angry man feel heard without giving him anything he did not deserve." Louis was quiet for a moment. He leaned against the stall post and looked at her, and in the warm lantern light of the barn he looked like something that had always been there, like a part of the landscape she had simply failed to notice until now. "My mother," he said at last. "She had the gift of making people feel seen. I paid attention." It was in that moment, Martha would realize later, that she knew she was in trouble. August was when the first shadow fell. A man came to the ranch on a Tuesday afternoon, arriving without announcement, riding a black horse that had been ridden hard. He was heavyset, somewhere in his late 30s, with a thick beard and pale eyes that moved around the yard with the assessing quality of someone taking an inventory. He said his name was Clyde Marsh, and he said he was an old friend of Louis's from his time in Missouri. Martha was alone in the yard when he arrived, Louis being out on the east pasture. She offered him water and told him Louis would be back within the hour. Clyde Marsh sat on the porch steps and drank the water and looked at the ranch with those pale, calculating eyes and made conversation that was courteous on its surface but felt underneath like something probing. "Nice piece of land," he said. "How many acres?" 800, Martha said. "Good water. We have a well and access to a seasonal creek. Worth a good sum, I imagine, a spread like this." "I imagined so," Martha said, and she kept her face pleasant and her voice easy. When Louis came in from the east pasture and saw Clyde Marsh on the porch, his reaction was brief but unmistakable. A flicker of something crossed his face, not quite surprise, because he controlled it too quickly for surprise, but something tighter and more complicated. He swung down from Cypress and shook Marsh's hand, and the two men spoke privately near the barn for 20 minutes while Martha went back into the house. That evening, Louis was quieter than usual at supper. Martha did not press him. She watched him across the table and thought about the flicker she had seen in his face. "Old friend from Missouri?" she asked eventually. "We knew each other years ago," Louis said. "Not a close friendship." He asked a lot of questions about the ranch. Louis looked up from his plate. "What kind of questions?" "Practical ones, acreage, water, value." Something moved behind his gray eyes that he did not name. He said, "I will make sure he moves on quickly." Clyde Marsh left the following morning, and Louis seemed to settle back into himself, and the days moved forward in their established rhythm, and Martha let it go. She should not have let it go. September brought the harvest and the beautiful, brutal work of early fall on the Kansas plain. They were busier than they had been all summer, and the long days and common purpose drew them even closer. One afternoon, Louis rode alongside her on the northern boundary, checking the fence line, and their horses walked in easy companionship through the golden green grass, and Louis reached across and very gently, without preamble, took her hand. They rode like that for 100 yards without speaking. Then Martha said, "I have been wondering how long it would take you to do that." "I have been wondering the same thing," he said, and she heard the warmth in his voice, that quiet undercurrent that was always there when he spoke to her. And she turned to look at him, and he was already looking at her. They dismounted at the old cottonwood tree at the corner of the north field, and under the wide Kansas sky, with the grass moving around them like a slow green tide, Louis Barnett told Martha Shelton that he had not expected this, that he had come to Caldwell looking for work, and had found something he had not known he was searching for, and that what he felt for her was not a convenient feeling or a simple one, but something that had grown over months with the permanence of something planted deep. Martha looked at him for a long moment, this man who had come into her life at the moment of its greatest fragility and made it stronger with his steadiness and his honesty and his quiet, persistent care. "I am not a woman who says things I do not mean," she told him. "So I will tell you plainly that I have not felt safe in a long time, not since before my father got sick, and since you came I have felt safe. I want you to know that I understand what that is worth." He kissed her gently once, there under the cottonwood tree, and it was the most natural thing that had ever happened in either of their lives. They were careful still, after that, careful with the ranch hand's awareness of their changed relationship, careful with the town of Caldwell's inevitable interest in a widow's hired man becoming something more, careful with each other's hearts in the way that people are careful when they have both known loss and understand what it costs. But they were happy. That was the unguarded, unmistakable truth of those September weeks. Martha Shelton was happy in a way she had almost forgotten was possible. And then October came, and everything broke open. It started with a letter that was not addressed to her. She found it entirely by accident. Louis had asked her to retrieve the ledger from his saddlebag, which was hanging on the peg inside the bunkhouse door. And when she opened the bag to find the ledger, she found, beneath it, a folded envelope addressed to Louis Barnett in a hand she did not recognize. She would not have opened it. She was not that kind of woman, and she understood the sanctity of correspondence, except that the letter had already been opened and was loose inside the envelope. And as she pulled the ledger out, the letter came with it and unfolded in her hand. She read 3 lines before she understood what she was reading. The letter was from a man named Harlan Voss, written in Wichita, and it referred to an arrangement. It used that word, arrangement, regarding the Shelton property in Caldwell. It noted that the agreed timeline was approaching and that the principals were growing impatient. It reminded Louis of his obligation and noted that his compensation upon successful transfer of the deed would be substantial. Successful transfer of the deed. Martha stood in the bunkhouse with the letter in her hands, and the world she had built over the past 7 months rearranging itself around her into something unrecognizable. She stood there long enough that the light changed through the single window. Then she walked to the cabin's small storage area and, moving on a cold and deliberate instinct, checked behind the loose board near the floor that she had noticed Louis testing one afternoon and assumed was simply a structural concern. Behind the board was a small oilskin packet. Inside the packet was a photograph, a formal portrait of herself taken 3 years ago in Wichita, before her father's illness. A photograph she had not sent to anyone and had no idea how anyone outside Caldwell might possess. And beneath the photograph was another document, a rough sketch map of the Shelton Ranch property with notes in a hand she recognized as Louis's, marking the well, the creek access, the best grazing land, the value estimates. She was still standing there, holding the photograph and the map, when she heard Clyde Marsh's voice in the yard. She had not heard him arrive. She should have heard him arrive. But she had been inside and lost in the quiet catastrophe of what she had found, and now Marsh was outside and he was talking to Louis in a low and urgent voice, and she heard Louis say sharply, "Not here. Not now." "Voss is losing patience," Marsh said. The plan was spring acquisition, not a year-long romance. "What exactly are you playing at, Barnett?" Martha stepped to the bunkhouse door. Both men turned to look at her, and in that moment, in the fractured, terrible silence of it, she saw everything clearly, the confirmation in Marsh's face, the devastation in Louis's. She said, "I think you should explain this to me." What followed was 30 seconds of absolute silence, broken only by the wind and the distant sound of cattle. Then Marsh took 3 steps toward her and produced a revolver from beneath his coat, and everything became the moment she would later call the breaking point. The gun at her temple, the cold evening light, Louis's hands raised, his face open with a terror that told her everything she needed to know about how much she still meant to him and how little that currently helped. "Tell her," Marsh said to Louis. "Tell her about Harlan Voss and what Barnett was hired to do." Louis's eyes were on Martha's face. He was not looking at the gun. He was looking at her, and she had never seen a man look so thoroughly destroyed from the inside. "Harlan Voss is a land speculator in Wichita," Louis said. His voice was very controlled. "He has been buying up distressed properties across southern Kansas for 3 years. When your father's loan became public record, Voss identified your ranch as a target. He hired me to come here, gain your trust, assess the property, and help him engineer a circumstance under which you would be pressured to sell, or in which he could acquire the deed through other means." "Other means," Martha said. "That was the arrangement Voss described to me," Louis said. "I want you to hear me say clearly that I never intended to follow through with it. And yet here we are," Martha said. "I know. You have been documenting my land. You have been reporting to this man. I sent Voss 2 reports, both of them deliberately vague and incomplete. I was trying to buy time." "Time for what?" The gun pressed harder against Martha's temple, and Marsh said, "Enough conversation. Barnett, you're going to get me the deed documents and the signed transfer papers you have been sitting on for 2 months, or this woman finds out exactly how little your conscience is worth." Everything that happened next was very fast. Louis moved. Not toward Marsh, not the way a man charges another man. He moved sideways, fast, drawing Marsh's attention and aim instinctively toward himself, and in the fraction of a second that Marsh's gun followed Louis, Martha dropped straight down. She had grown up on a ranch. She had handled livestock her whole life. She was not a woman who froze. She went down to the ground and rolled left and came up running toward the barn, and behind her she heard Marsh curse, and then the sound of a scuffle, boots on hard dirt, a grunt of exertion, a single sharp crack that was a fist connecting with something solid. She got to the barn door and turned. Louis had Marsh's gun hand pinned against the fence post, his other forearm at Marsh's throat. Marsh was a bigger man and he was fighting hard, But Louis had the leverage and the desperation, and desperation counts for a great deal. Pio appeared from around the corner of the barn with a shotgun, moving at a steady walk with the unhurried precision of a man who had been in difficult situations before, and understood that calm was the most valuable tool available. "I suggest you be still," Pio said to Marsh, and Marsh, finding himself looking into a shotgun barrel held by a man who seemed entirely at peace with the world, became still. Martha walked toward Louis. He was breathing hard, his shirt torn at the shoulder, a cut opening along his jaw from where Marsh had caught him. He released Marsh's gun hand and stepped back, and Pio kept the shotgun level. "Pio, will you please hold this man until I can ride to town and fetch Marshal Hendricks?" Martha said. "Yes," Pio said. She looked at Louis. "And you," she said, "are going to sit down and tell me everything, every single thing, from the beginning." "Yes," Louis said, "I will." They sat on the porch steps, the same porch steps where Marsh had sat in August, asking about acreage and water value, and Martha thought with a cold clarity that she should have trusted her first instinct that day, the sense of something probing beneath the courtesy. Louis told her everything without evasion. He had been in Wichita in February, broke and between ranches, when a man named Voss had approached him through a mutual contact. Voss had offered him $200, half up front, half on delivery, to go to Caldwell, respond to the Shelton advertisement, take the ranch manager position, and prepare the groundwork for a forced sale. The plan, as Voss described it, involved Louis eventually presenting Martha with a fabricated debt notice through a corrupted bank contact, creating the impression that the ranch was in financial danger again, then offering to help negotiate a sale to Voss as the only viable solution. "You took the money," Martha said. "I took the $100 up front," Louis said. "I was desperate. I told myself it was just information gathering, that no one would really be hurt. And then you came here. And then I came here," he said, "and none of it was what I expected." He looked at his hands. "Within a week I understood that this was not a distressed property being abandoned. This was a woman fighting with everything she had to hold onto something real and important. And within a month I understood that you were—" He stopped, started again. "I understood that what I felt for you was not part of any plan. It was the most honest thing I had experienced in years. So you kept the information you sent to Voss deliberately unhelpful. I sent him 2 letters in April and May that told him nothing he could use. I told him the property was more complicated than expected. He began sending Marsh to apply pressure. The visit in August. Yes, Marsh was checking on my progress, reminding me of the arrangement." He paused. "I told him the deal was off. He told me Voss did not accept cancellations." Martha looked out at the Kansas evening, the first stars coming up over the flat horizon. The anger inside her was precise and burning and cold all at once. It was not the wild, consuming anger of someone betrayed by a stranger. It was the specific, surgical pain of someone who had let herself trust and had been proven right to trust and wrong at the same time. "You should have told me," she said. "Yes," he said. "When you realized what you felt for me, when you decided to subvert Voss's plan, you should have told me immediately. I know that. I was afraid. I was afraid that if I told you the truth you would send me away and I would have both lost you and failed to protect you. That was cowardice dressed up as strategy." The word landed between them, cowardice. He had chosen it himself, and that mattered. "Is there anything else?" Martha asked. "Any other hidden thing, any other arrangement or secret?" "Nothing," he said. "I swear to you on whatever you will accept my oath on." She believed him. She hated that she believed him so immediately, but she had spent months learning the texture of this man's honesty, and she knew the difference between it and the performance of honesty, and what she saw in his face now was as real as anything she had ever seen. That did not make it uncomplicated. She rode to town and brought back Marshal Hendricks, a competent man in his 40s who had been Caldwell's marshal for 6 years, and who took Clyde Marsh into custody, with the businesslike efficiency of someone who had been waiting for something like this for a while. Marsh's connections to Harlan Voss and the land fraud scheme were, it would eventually emerge, not a new enterprise. Voss had been engaged in this business for several years across multiple counties, and the marshal's investigation, which unfolded over the following weeks, would bring down a network that had defrauded at least 4 families of their land. But that was later. The night of Marsh's arrest, Martha rode back to the ranch alone in the dark, and she sat at her kitchen table for a long time. In the morning, she told Louis that she needed time. She told him that she did not believe the man who had held a gun to her head was the man she had come to know over these past months, but that the man who had come to Caldwell with a scheme and had not told her the truth when it mattered was also, undeniably, a real man, and she needed to understand how both of those things could be true. Louis said, "I understand. I will not ask for more than that." He continued working the ranch. He was careful with her, not in the overly solicitous, apologetic way that would have felt manipulative, but in the simple, consistent way of a man keeping his word when his word was the only thing he had left to offer. He was good at his work. He was decent to Pio and to the cattle and to the land. He did not make grand gestures. He did not crowd her or press her. The days were hard. Martha moved through them with the kind of efficiency that is really a form of armor, keeping her hands busy and her mind on concrete tasks, letting herself feel the full complexity of the situation only in the evenings when the work was done and she was alone. She missed him. Even while she was angry at him, she missed the version of him she had trusted completely, and she was furious at herself for missing what was perhaps a constructed thing. But she could not quite make herself believe it was entirely constructed, because the ranch was in better shape than it had ever been, and the debt was paid, and the fence line was solid, and none of that had been necessary if the goal was to manufacture distress. He had done real work. He had fixed real problems. He had kissed her under a cottonwood tree and told her the truth about himself in every way except the most important one, and she kept returning to that contradiction because it refused to resolve cleanly. A week after Marsh's arrest, she received a letter from Marshal Hendricks confirming that Clyde Marsh had given a full statement implicating Harlan Voss, and that Louis Barnett's name had appeared in that statement, but only as a recruited agent who had, according to Marsh himself, refused to complete the assignment and had been considered a liability by Voss for the past several months. The marshal noted that in his assessment, Barnett's actions on the evening of the confrontation demonstrated clearly where his actual loyalties lay. Martha read that letter at the kitchen table. She set it down and looked at the window. Then she put on her coat and walked to the bunkhouse and knocked on the door. Louis opened it. He had clearly not been sleeping. He looked at her with those gray eyes that she had spent months learning to read. "I have been thinking about something you said," she told him. "On the porch after Marsh was taken. You said it was cowardice dressed up as strategy." "It was," he said. "I have been asking myself whether I believe you changed your mind and your purpose before or after you developed feelings for me. Whether any of this was real." He waited. "And I have concluded," she said slowly, choosing each word the way she chose everything deliberately with care, "that the two things happen together, that they cannot be separated, that you began to subvert Voss's plan because you began to see me clearly, and you began to see me clearly because you were falling in love with me, and that these things being connected does not make either of them less true." "That is more understanding than I deserve," he said. "Probably," she agreed. "I am not telling you it is forgotten. I am telling you it is something I can work with if you can give me absolute honesty from this point forward. No more hidden things, no more protective silences. If something frightens you or complicates things or threatens this ranch or threatens me, you tell me." "I will," he said. "Martha, I will." "Good," she said. "Then come back inside. Supper was an hour ago and there is food staying warm and I am tired of eating alone." He came inside. The weeks that followed were different from what had come before, not simpler but deeper. The ease between them had been cracked open and rebuilt, and what was rebuilt was sturdier, because it was built on the full truth of who they each were. Martha found that knowing the worst of Louis's history did not diminish him in her eyes as much as it added dimension to him, the dimension of a man who had made a wrong choice in a moment of desperation and had then spent months working quietly to undo it, not because someone was watching, but because his conscience would not let him do otherwise. And Louis, for his part, moved through the days with a new kind of ease that Martha realized was the ease of a man who was no longer carrying a secret. He was lighter, he laughed more, he was more fully himself. In November the weather turned, as it does on the Kansas plain, with a ferocity that reminded everyone that the land set the terms and human beings adapted. A 3-day storm kept them mostly inside, and they sat by the fire in the evenings with Pio dealing cards between them, and it was on the second evening of the storm that Louis said, with the directness she had come to love in him, "I would like to marry you." Martha looked up from her cards. "I am not asking right now," he added. "I am telling you that I intend to ask, and I wanted you to know it was coming so it would not be a surprise." Pio set his cards down with the expression of a man who had been waiting for this particular development for some months and was gratified to see it finally arrive. "That is an interesting approach to a proposal," Martha said. "I thought you preferred information in advance," Louis said. She looked at him across the fire-lit room, this man who had come to her life tangled in someone else's scheme and had become, despite all of it, the most trustworthy person she had known since her father. She thought about what her father would have made of him. She thought her father would have shaken his hand at the kitchen table after an hour with the books and said, "This one knows what he is doing." "I will need to think about it," she said. "Of course," he said. "But," she added, "I think you should probably know that my thinking is almost certainly going to arrive at yes." Pio picked his cards back up. "Good," he said simply. The formal proposal came 3 weeks later, on a clear December afternoon when the first real cold had settled onto the land and the grass was amber and the sky was the particular hard blue of winter on the prairie. Louis took her back to the cottonwood tree on the north boundary, which she recognized as deliberate and meaningful, the place where this had truly started, and he went down on one knee in the amber grass and told her that he loved her with the whole, uncomplicated, clear-eyed entirety of himself, and that he wanted to spend the rest of his life working alongside her on this land she loved, and that he was asking for the privilege of being her partner in every sense of that word. He produced a ring, a simple gold band with a small garnet stone that he had purchased in Caldwell 2 weeks earlier, which Pio had known about and Martha had known nothing about, which was the only successful secret Louis Barnett would ever keep from her again. She said yes. She said it immediately, without the deliberation she applied to almost everything else in her life, because this was not a decision that required deliberation. It was a recognition. They were married in February of 1883 at the Caldwell Methodist Church, a small ceremony with the Reverend Pio standing as witness, and a handful of townspeople who had come to respect Martha in her 14 months of fighting to hold her land. The church ladies who had brought casseroles after her father's death were in the front pew with expressions of satisfied approval. Marshal Hendricks came and shook Louis's hand and told him he had better keep making good decisions, and Louis said he intended to. The wedding supper was at the ranch house, which Martha had cleaned and decorated with the careful attention she brought to everything that mattered. There were candles on the table and a beef roast and a cake that Martha had baked herself, which was slightly lopsided and tasted wonderful. Louis looked at her across the supper table in the candlelight and she looked back at him, and there was in that exchange everything that had been built between them over the past year, the difficulty and the trust and the rebuilding and the choice made daily to keep moving toward each other rather than away. "Happy?" he asked. "Profoundly," she said. Spring came and the ranch expanded. Louis negotiated the purchase of an additional 60 acres from the Garland property. Emmett Garland, who had ultimately proved more reasonable than his reputation suggested, sold at a fair price, and seemed relieved to have the transaction handled by someone who did not make him feel like he was being robbed. The Shelton Ranch, which was now the Shelton Barnett operation, though Martha kept the Shelton name in the title as her father's legacy, grew to 860 acres with a strengthened water arrangement and an improved barn that Louis and Pio rebuilt over the course of 3 weeks in April. Harlan Voss was arrested in Wichita in March, indicted on multiple counts of land fraud affecting 6 families across 3 counties. His trial was conducted in the fall of 1883, and Louis was called to testify. He went to Wichita with Martha, who refused to let him go alone into the city where a man who had tried to take her land would face judgment, and she sat in the Wichita courtroom in her best dress with her hands folded and her face composed, and heard Louis give his testimony with complete and unflinching honesty, including the fact that he had initially accepted Voss's money and come to Caldwell under false pretenses, because he had committed to complete honesty, and he meant it. Voss was convicted on all charges and sentenced to 8 years in the Kansas State Penitentiary in Lansing. It was not enough, Martha thought, for what he had taken from the families he had defrauded, but it was something. On the train back to Caldwell, Louis held her hand and she looked out the window at the Kansas plain moving past in the autumn gold light, and she thought about all the things that had been taken and all the things that had been kept and all the things that had been built, and she felt something large and quiet and solid in the center of herself that she recognized as gratitude. "Thank you," she said. "For what?" Louis asked. "For testifying honestly about all of it. You did not have to include the beginning. No one would have pushed you on it. You would have known if I left it out," he said. "Yes," she said, "I would have." He was quiet for a moment. The train moved through the amber grassland and the sky was very big and very clear above it. "I decided a long time ago," he said, "that I would rather be fully known and accepted than partially known and comfortable. The first way is the only way anything real gets built." Martha looked at him. She thought about that. She thought it was one of the truest things she had ever heard. "Then we are in agreement," she said. The winter of 1883 into 1884 was the warmest either of them had experienced in Kansas, and the ranch benefited from it. The cattle herd had grown to 90 head, which was more than the original Shelton operation had ever managed. They had hired a second hand in the fall, a young man of 19 named Samuel Graves, who was green but willing and learning fast under Pio's instruction. The operation was running well and generating enough to cover its costs and build a modest reserve. In February of 1884, Martha told Louis she was expecting a child. She told him at breakfast, across the kitchen table where they had first gone through the books together nearly 2 years before, and she watched his face move through a series of expressions that she would treasure for the rest of her life: surprise, then a flooding warmth, then a joy so large it seemed to require the entire room to contain it. He came around the table and held her, and she pressed her face against his shoulder and laughed, which was not what she expected to do but was completely right. "When?" he asked. "August, I think, maybe September." He pulled back enough to look at her face, and he was still holding her and still wearing the expression of someone who had been given something they had been afraid to hope for. "Are you well? Are you feeling well?" "I am feeling quite well and also a little sick in the mornings, which I am told is normal." "What do you need?" "I need you to sit back down and finish breakfast," she said, "and to not treat me as though I am suddenly made of glass, because I have been working this land my whole life, and that is not going to change." "Understood," he said, but she could hear the smile in it. He did not treat her as though she were made of glass. He was considerate in practical ways, taking on the heavier outdoor work without discussion, making sure she ate well, being awake and present when the mornings were difficult. But he followed her lead on what she was capable of, which was most things, and he trusted her knowledge of her own body, which was the most important thing. The baby came in September of 1884, a boy, born in the ranch house with the help of Dr. Caldwell from town, and a neighbor woman named Mrs. Grace Fenton, who had served as midwife at more births than she could count. It was a long labor, and Martha was fierce and exhausted and magnificent throughout it, and Louis sat in the hallway outside the bedroom for 11 hours in a state of controlled anxiety that Pio addressed periodically by bringing him coffee. When Dr. Caldwell opened the door and said, "You have a healthy son," Louis stood up so fast he knocked the coffee cup off the windowsill. They named him Hector James Barnett. Hector for Martha's father, James for Louis's older brother who had died of fever in Missouri when Louis was 17. The names felt right, a carrying forward of the people who had shaped them into the new life they were making together. Hector James was, by any objective measure, a loud and hungry and vigorous baby, and he took to the world with an enthusiasm that his parents found both exhausting and deeply encouraging. He had Louis's gray eyes and Martha's dark hair, and a temperament that was already clearly his own, given to sudden laughter and equally sudden indignation, and a physical boldness that showed itself early in his tendency to grab at everything within reach. The ranch grew around him. By the time Hector was walking, the operation had expanded again. Louis had negotiated a cattle supply contract with a new rail depot northeast of Caldwell, which gave them a reliable market and improved their income significantly. Pio had taken on a mentoring role with young Samuel Graves that seemed to satisfy something in both of them, and the bunkhouse had been expanded to accommodate Samuel comfortably. Martha had replanted the south pasture that had burned in the prairie fire of her first summer alone, and it was producing well. The Shelton Barnett Ranch had become exactly what Martha had always believed it could be: a real, viable, growing operation on good land, built by people who understood that the land was not a resource to be consumed, but a relationship to be honored. In the summer of 1886, when Hector was almost 2 and developing a deep professional interest in the barn cats, Martha and Louis sat on the porch in the long Kansas evening, and Louis said, "I have been thinking about writing to my brother Thomas in Missouri." "You should," Martha said. She knew about Thomas, the younger of the 2 surviving brothers, a man who had stayed on the family farm after their mother died, and who Louis wrote to occasionally but had not seen in 5 years. "I would like him to know what we have built here," Louis said. "I would like him to see it." "Then invite him to come," Martha said simply. Thomas Barnett arrived in October of that year, a man of 27 with Louis's coloring and a more openly expressive disposition than his brothers. He took one look at the ranch and then at his brother and said, "I should have come sooner." He stayed 3 months, and during those 3 months something quietly remarkable happened, which Martha noticed with a private satisfaction and did not mention until it was fully evident. Thomas Barnett and Grace Fenton, the neighbor woman who had helped at Hector's birth and had become a friend of the household, spent a great deal of time in each other's company during Thomas's visit, and by December it was clear to everyone who paid attention that Thomas was considering whether there might be a reason to make his return from Missouri considerably shorter than his departure from it. He returned to Missouri in January of 1887. He was back in April, with his possessions packed on a wagon, having sold his share of the family farm to the neighbor who had always wanted it. He married Grace Fenton the following June. Martha and Louis stood together at that wedding in the same Caldwell Methodist Church where they had been married 4 years earlier, and Martha held Hector, 3 years old now, and deeply concerned with the flowers on the altar, and felt Louis's hand find hers. And she thought about the way lives accumulated around each other, the way one love story seeded others, the way a family grew not just from 2 people choosing each other, but from the whole living network of relationships that gathered around that choice. In 1888, Martha was expecting again, and this time the spring was cool and pleasant and the pregnancy was easier, and in July she delivered a daughter. They named her Clara Rose Barnett, Clara for a version of clarity that Martha associated with the best moments of her life, and Rose because Louis, when asked his opinion on names for a daughter, had said simply, "Something that sounds like it has always been here," And a rose, Martha thought, was exactly that on the Kansas plain, something that bloomed in the difficulty and did not apologize for its beauty. Clara Rose had Martha's temperament, which meant she was thoughtful and deliberate and stubborn in the good way, and she had her father's eyes, and by the time she was 2, she was following her brother around the ranch with a competence that Hector found both impressive and occasionally inconvenient. The family was whole. That was the word Martha came back to in the evenings when the work was done, and the children were sleeping, and she and Louis sat on the porch in the summer dark or by the fire in the winter evenings. Whole. Not perfect, because the frontier was not a place that accommodated perfection, and because the people who made up this family were fully human and therefore complicated, but whole in the way that something is whole when all its necessary parts are present and connected. Pio retired from active ranch work in 1889, the year he turned 75, though retirement for Pio meant a reduction in physical labor and an increase in the time he spent instructing anyone who would stand still long enough to learn. Samuel Graves had become a capable, responsible ranch hand who had been offered a foreman position at a larger operation east of Caldwell and had declined it, telling Louis that he preferred to stay where he was, which Martha took as a compliment to both the ranch and the man who managed it. Louis, now 38 years old, had the look of a man who had been shaped by his work in the best possible way. The leanness of him had become a kind of economy of movement, a physical efficiency that came from years of knowing exactly what needed to be done and doing it without waste. His hair had a silver thread in it at the temples that Martha found extremely fine, and she told him so, which made him laugh in the surprised way he still occasionally laughed when she said something she meant straightforwardly that he received as a gift. In the spring of 1890, a letter arrived from Gerald Prout, the Wichita lawyer who had sent the very first letter 8 years earlier, the one informing Martha of her father's debt and the 60-day foreclosure notice. He wrote to inform her that a land appraisal firm had been contacted regarding a possible sale offer for the Shelton Barnett Ranch, which someone had apparently submitted through a Wichita broker. Martha read this letter and felt, for one quick cold moment, the echo of 1882, the fear, the threat, the vulnerability. Then she handed the letter to Louis and watched him read it. He looked up at her with clear, steady eyes. "We are not selling," he said. "No," she agreed. "And if someone wants to attempt what Voss attempted, they are going to find that the circumstances have changed considerably." "They are," she said. She wrote to Prout declining the unsolicited inquiry with a courtesy that was fully genuine and entirely final. She never heard from the broker again. That summer they rode the property together, just the two of them, on a long Saturday afternoon while Pio watched the children at the house. They rode the whole perimeter, the eastern boundary where the fence had failed in that long-ago storm, the north corner where the cottonwood tree still stood, the south pasture now lush and green again after years of recovery, the creek access, the well, the best grazing land. Martha had ridden this land her whole life. She had ridden it with her father, learning its character the way you learn a person's character, through long attention. She had ridden it alone in those desperate, determined months after her father died. She had ridden it with Louis, first professionally, then with the slowly gathering awareness of something changing between them. She stopped Cypress Louis's mare, who had become Martha's preferred ride when Louis was on a younger horse they had acquired the year before at the cottonwood tree on the north boundary. The tree was larger than it had been 8 years ago, or perhaps she was simply more aware of it. The Kansas sky was a deep summer blue above it, the kind of blue that made the world look like it had been made very carefully and very deliberately. Louis stopped alongside her. He did not speak. He understood that she had stopped here because of what had happened here, and he let the moment be what it was. "I want to tell you something," Martha said. "All right," he said. "I was very angry at you," she said. "For a long time and about a specific thing I was genuinely angry. Not the hot, immediate anger of the night Marsh had a gun at my head. The other kind." The quiet, grinding kind that comes from feeling like you almost did not get to have something that you did not know you needed until it was nearly taken from you. He was quiet, listening with the full attention she had always loved in him. "And I want you to know," she continued, "that the anger is completely gone. It went somewhere gradually over these years, and I do not know exactly when it left, but it is entirely gone. What is left is," she looked at the tree, the land, the sky. "Everything," she said. "What is left is everything." He reached across, took her hand the way he had on their first real ride together along the northern boundary, simply, without ceremony. "I know I came here under false pretenses," he said. "I have thought about that more than you might imagine. About the fact that the best thing that has ever happened to me began with a lie." "It began with a letter," Martha said. "A letter that told the truth about what you could do and what you were looking for. The rest was someone else's plan that you refused to finish. I have made my peace with the distinction." "I love you," he said. It was the kind of declaration he made occasionally, quietly, at moments like this, not in the performed romantic gesture, but in the moment where it was simply the most accurate thing to say. "I know," she said. And then, because she wanted him to have it clearly and completely, "I love you. This ranch, these children, this life, I love all of it. But you are the center of it. You have been the center of it since before I allowed myself to admit it." They rode back to the house through the summer afternoon, and the grassland moved around them in the warm wind. And somewhere ahead of them, the sound of Hector shouting at one of the barn cats drifted across the yard, followed by Clara's more methodical commentary on whatever was happening, and Pio's voice saying something in the patient, instructive tone he applied equally to children and young ranch hands. Martha let herself feel the fullness of it, the realness of the life she had built and held onto and expanded, through debt and grief and betrayal and fear, and the hard, true work of trusting someone past the point where trust was safe. That evening after supper, after the children were in bed and Pio had gone to his room and Samuel was in the bunkhouse, Martha and Louis sat on the porch in the warm summer dark. The stars were very bright, the vast Kansas sky clear and close. The sounds of the ranch at night moved around them, a horse shifting in the barn, the distant call of a nighthawk, the low occasional sound of cattle in the far pasture. "When Thomas writes," Louis said, "he says he and Grace are thinking of building a larger house on their property." "He tells me the same thing," Martha said. "I think they are expecting again. That would make 4 children between the 2 families." "It would," Martha said. Louis was quiet for a moment. "I think about this sometimes," he said. "When I left Missouri in 1882, I had nothing and no particular direction and a bad choice behind me. I could not have described this, any of this. I did not have the imagination for it." "And now?" Martha asked. "Now I cannot imagine anything else," he said simply. "Now this is everything that is real." She leaned her head against his shoulder, and he put his arm around her, and they sat in the summer dark with the Kansas sky spread above them, enormous and full of stars. In the years that followed, the Shelton Barnett Ranch continued to grow and adapt, as the frontier itself was changing in those years. The open range being slowly replaced by fenced operations, the cattle trails shifting as the railroads expanded, the small towns growing into established communities with proper schools and churches and newspapers. Caldwell was changing, and the ranch changed with it, always led by the combination of Martha's strategic clarity and Louis's operational skill, the 2 of them working in a partnership that was the best kind, complementary, honest, built on the full knowledge of each other. Hector started school in Caldwell in 1890, riding in with Samuel on mornings when the weather allowed, and came home with the serious purposefulness of a child who took learning as a genuine occupation. He had his mother's capacity for sustained attention and his father's way with numbers, and his teacher, a Miss Alverston who had come from Ohio with considerable education, and a complete underestimation of how much she would come to love the Kansas plains, wrote to Martha in the spring of that first year that Hector was one of the most engaged students she had had the pleasure of teaching. Martha read that letter at the kitchen table with the same table where she had first read the letter from Gerald Prout 8 years earlier, and she thought about what a table could hold across the years. The letters of crisis and the letters of pride, the supper conversations and the proposals, and the small daily accumulations of a life lived honestly. Clara started school 2 years later and immediately made her opinions about the curriculum clearly known, which her teacher found challenging and her parents found entirely predictable. She had inherited Martha's directness along with her mother's dark hair, and by the time she was 8, she was already determined to know everything about how the ranch operated, following Louis and Pio through the work with a focused attention that reminded Martha powerfully of herself at the same age following her father. Pio died in the winter of 1892, quietly in his sleep, at the age of 78. He had been with the Shelton land for 31 years. Martha held his funeral at the ranch, not at the church, because the land had been his home, and she believed a man should be sent off from home. She spoke about him with the honest directness she brought to everything important, and Louis stood beside her and held her hand while she spoke, and they buried Pio under the cottonwood tree on the north boundary, which felt exactly right to everyone who had known him. They kept his room as it had been for a year, not out of grief, but out of respect. Then Samuel Graves, who had become as much a member of the household as any hired hand could be, moved his things into the larger room, and the continuity of the place was maintained. By 1895, Martha was 40 years old and Louis was 44, and the Shelton Barnett Ranch was 120 acres larger than it had been when Louis arrived, free of debt, operating with a small but reliable profit, and staffed by Samuel and 2 younger men whom he had hired and trained himself. Hector, at 11, was helping with the lighter ranch work on weekends with the disciplined competence of someone who had been watching how it was done his whole life. Clara, at 8, was dividing her attention between school, books, and an increasingly focused campaign to be allowed to help with the horses, which Louis eventually conceded was clearly inevitable and might as well be properly supervised. On a warm evening in May of that year, Martha and Louis walked the northern boundary together, on foot this time, leaving the horses in the barn, moving through the long grass in the evening light. They came to the cottonwood tree where Pio rested, and they stood there for a while in comfortable silence, the way people stand at the graves of those they have loved when grief has become something softer and more integrated, not a wound but a permanence, a presence rather than an absence. He would be proud of this place, Louis said. He would be critical of the fence post on the northeast corner, Martha said. He was always critical of that fence post. Louis laughed. He was right about the fence post. He was right about most things, Martha said. She took Louis's hand and they stood in the evening grass at the cottonwood tree, and the Kansas sky was doing what it did in May, putting on a sunset of considerable drama and beauty, the kind that looked almost too vivid to be real, all gold and deep rose along the horizon and the first pale stars appearing above it. "This is not where I expected to end up," Louis said. "Where did you expect to end up?" "Honestly, I did not expect to end up anywhere in particular. I was not someone who imagined a future in those years. I survived and worked and moved and tried not to examine things too closely." "And now you examine things too closely," she said. "All the time," he agreed. "I examine everything. I think it is because I understand now what it is worth." She leaned into his shoulder. He wrapped his arm around her. Behind them, from the direction of the house, they could hear Hector's voice and Clara's voice and the ordinary music of their children in the evening, the specific, unrepeatable music of this particular family in this particular place and time. "I want to tell you something I have never said precisely," Martha said. "Tell me," he said. "When my father died and I was alone in this house reading that first letter from the bank, I was not afraid of the debt. I was afraid of the loneliness. I was afraid that I was going to spend the rest of my life doing exactly what I had always done, in exactly this place I had always loved, and that the doing and the loving would be real and true, but that there would be no one standing beside me who fully knew me, no one to see the whole of it. She paused. The sunset was deepening. "You see the whole of it," she said. "You have for a long time. And that is the thing I did not know I needed until you were already providing it. And that is the thing I am most grateful for. And that is what I wanted to say precisely." Louis was quiet for a long moment. She could feel the warmth of him alongside her, the steadiness that was the most essentially him thing about him, that quality of being fully present, of not being somewhere else. "I came to this land as someone else's instrument," he said. "I stayed as myself. Everything I am that is worth being I became here, in this place with you." He turned to look at her, and she turned to look at him. And in the evening light at the cottonwood tree with the Kansas sky burning gold behind him, he was everything she had needed when she had not known what she needed, the full, honest, entirely known presence of the person who had chosen her and been chosen, who had been lost and found and had chosen again every day since. She kissed him, there at Pio's tree as the sun went down, and it tasted like the full and permanent truth of everything they had built. They walked back to the house in the failing light, hand in hand, through the grass that moved around them like breath, and the house was lit and warm and their children were inside it. And the ranch spread around them in all directions. The well, the barn, the pasture, the fence line that Louis had checked that morning and Hector had helped him with, the south pasture green after 15 years of recovery, the north boundary where everything had started and where everything continued to grow. Martha Shelton Barnett stepped up onto the porch of the house her father had built and looked out at the land her family now held, and felt in the deepest and most unshakable part of herself that this was exactly where she was supposed to be. Behind her, Louis held the screen door open, the way he always did, and she walked into the warmth and light and life of everything they had made together. And the Kansas night settled over the Shelton Barnett ranch, and the stars came out enormous and clear, and the land lay patient and full and real in the dark, and everything that had been broken was mended, and everything that had been feared was past, and everything that had been built stood firm and whole and permanently, beautifully theirs.